I unfortunately have to go quite quickly after I've made these introductions for reasons that Kiki knows. And before I introduce the speakers, I just want to say, just to tee things up, I just want to make two very brief observations. And the first one is, as I think a lot of you know, I was certainly talking to somebody earlier on, there is an etymology to a lot of the terminology we are talking about. It doesn't have fixed meaning. The meanings of Chinese terms related to the things we've been discussing changes over time in relation to changing circumstances. If you want to find out about it, there's a wonderful book called Key Concepts of Chinese Philosophy, edited, I think, or written by Zhang Dainian, and that gives you a kind of intro into that. It kind of saves you from descending into abstractions. And it's very easy to do this kind of stuff and just apply a term and it be very abstract. The second point, as it relates to the talks that we're going to listen to, or you're going to listen to now, is that it's not really possible to disentangle Daoism from a wider history of Chinese intellectuality, particularly classical Chinese thought. So you can't really take it away totally from Confucianism or from Buddhism for all sorts of reasons that I'm sure you can find out. So two qualifying things: look at the etymology, and if you want to deal with certain issues, often you have to go beyond Daoism to look at its related or cognate discourses. Right, so two speakers. I'm going to introduce both, and then one would speak, and then the second one would speak. Now, our first speaker is Victor Fan, and Victor is a professor of film and media philosophy at King's College London, so a million miles away, a universe away, and a film festival consultant. He's also vice president of the Asian Cinema Studies Society, and he's author of lots and lots of books. And I think importantly, one most recent one in 2022, a couple of recent ones, 2022, Cinema Illuminating Reality, Media Philosophy Through Buddhism, which is extremely important, and Extraterritoriality, Locating Hong Kong Cinema and Media. Our second speaker is David. Now, David and I were both at the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China at the same time. Was I your boss?
You interviewed me and were my boss, yeah.
Yeah, I was,
wasn't it? Chinese New Year.
That wasn't much use for you then, was it? Anyway, we were both at the university and we moved on to greater things. David is a senior lecturer, associate professor at the University of Stirling. His research straddles the theoretical and practical sides of film philosophy and gravitates around the intersectionalities of screens, thinking and worlds. He's the editor of a book series, and I hope I'm going to get this right. The name of the Decolonising and Defamiliarising Edinburgh University Press book series he is co-founding editor of. So that's Thinking in Worlds. Screens, Thinking in Worlds. Thank you very much. And I could go through a whole series of films and books, but I'll light on a recent one, which I'm probably not going to be able to pronounce. So, where is it? Infinite Ontologies of the Chalathousi Stream?
It's an unpronounceable word, so you do well.
Right, yeah. It's an unpronounceable word. Posthumanism and Racial Capital in Contemporary Streaming Media, which came out in 2025. And David's been involved in a lot of other books and sort of online things. So welcome to our speakers, and I'm going to hand over to Victor, who's going to talk to us about the Ontologico-Technological double binding Neo-Confucianism. And that speaks to the second point I was making, is that Chinese thought is syncretic, and Neo-Confucianism in particular, since the Tang Dynasty, has been entirely syncretic. Victor, over to you, mate.
Thank you so much, Paul, and I apologize that I am beaming myself from only West London for a couple of reasons, because I've been under the weather. I don't want to infect everyone, and also the transportation today has been a little bit crazy. And so I also want to thank Vicky for organizing this, and also very importantly putting me on the same panel as David, because like we have been exchanging a lot of ideas all along. So today my talk is going to be taken from part of the first chapter of my forthcoming book, which is on algorithmic governmentality. And algorithmic governmentality really refers to the art of governance and also the actual practice of governance by means of collecting big data, using digital technology, surveillance, and kind of issues. And my first chapter is really about a huge project called Digit China. And so it was actually proposed a few years ago by the 14th five-year plan, and then later on reconfirmed, actually earlier this year in the 15th five-year plan. And in that particular discourse, I was especially fascinated with a call for philosophers, basically Chinese philosophers, and also even scientists, to use Neo-Confucianism especially, but also Daoism and Buddhism, as Paul argues, they really seem practically to reconfigure Marxism. So because of time, I can't really tell you like the entire scheme how it works, and so maybe in the Q&A I would be able to answer more questions. But today I'm actually going to focus on a really, really particular idea. The idea is that I'm trying to figure out one thing. The idea is that Neo-Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism are such ecologically we keep thinking about them as ecological, relational, and also even holistic. And somehow the idea is that how does a government, it doesn't necessarily mean the government, but a government, can solicit something that is so ecological, relational, and holistic to really, on the one hand, justifies use of data surveillance and big data collection as a way to promote democracy on the one hand, but at the same, on the one hand, to justify political violence, really. And so, and just to put it into context, the idea is that this particular debate is not limited to China. In India, for example, there have been like a lot of discussions in relation to Hinduism, for example, or even Buddhism. And in China, definitely, for example, the Tsinghua University Research Group on eco-civilization have also done a lot of research in this particular area. And so, one thing that I would like to bring out, you can say my argument for today is that within this syncretism, the idea is that the idea of using Buddhism and Taoism to really put them together with Confucianism, in that particular process, there is always, I find out that there is always a very interesting double bind of ethics, the idea of using ethics as both an ontological ground to politics, and at the same time using it as a technological, basically as technology of governance. And that double bind often creates a lot of tension. And in my talk today, I particularly focus on really a close reading exercise to really look at a particular debate around Zhou Dunyi's annotations of the Taiji Shuo. And of course, some of the responses his students Chen Hao and Chen Yi basically gave to not his students, but Zhu Zhu's students. And then basically, and the political appropriation of this debate by Zhu Xi and Wang Yangmin. And so, basically, I argue that in the process of rethinking Confucianism through Taoism, ethics can always be figured into this ontological technological double bind. Is there a problem with the connection?
Yes.
I feel like it's the speakers in the room are catching us.
Maybe
Maybe you can just mute the mic.
Can you say into the laptop?
Just click.
Okay. It's
Double click.
That's it.
I think, yeah.
okay. Is it better?
Yes.
All right. Okay. So let's actually take a look at Children Yu's explanations of explanations and Zhu Xi's revision of the Taiji Tu Shuo. And so and basically in his commentary on Zhou Yu's Taiji Tu Shuo, Zhu Xi is very confidently argues that well, like the Taiji Tu Shuo is based on the Confucian interpretations of Zhou Yu's of Zhou Yi, or Book of Changes. But there are actually two versions of the Taiji Tu Shuo. One of them is actually was actually used by Zhu Xi himself, which is actually, and there are many versions of it. And in this particular case, the printout is actually taken from the Ontologico-Technological edition, and so we call it the OF edition. And so it begins with the phrase "Wu Qi er Tai Qi," and you can say non-supreme as the infinite supreme. However, according to an earlier edition, which we can find in Academia Historica in Taipei, the first phrase is actually 自无极而太极. From non-supreme, the supreme is put into action. So, sorry. If we actually take a look at the two editions, the one on the right of screen is the one Zhu Xi commented on. Basically, when the non-supreme as infinite supreme is in movement, yang arises. Okay. 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 What? Do I need to repeat anything, or? Oh, okay. I can just continue. Okay. And then on the left, you can see the Academica Historica version, which basically means from non-supreme. The supreme is put into action when the supreme is in movement. And the rest is the same. So if we go back to the figure, you can see that this is supposed to be non-supreme, the empty circle, and the supreme is already a circle in which yin and yang, dong and xing are already in movement. And so the idea is that for Zhu Xi's edition, you can totally see that he is actually putting these two together, the non-supreme as supreme. Whereas the Academia Historica edition, which is supposed to be an earlier edition, would say that no, they're two different things, non-supreme from non-supreme to supreme. And so these two different versions actually have, it has a lot of kind of stories behind it, and also have implies very different kind of ontological schemas. So we can look at different scholars' opinions on this particular idea, because there is no agreement really, but we can actually kind of construct a narrative out of this later on. Chen Guoying basically argues that the AH edition really corresponds to the cosmological view of chapter 42 of the Laozi, and many of you would know the Tao generates oneness, oneness generates two-ness, two-ness generates three-ness, three-ness generates all things. Everything shoulders yin and embraces yang. Searching qi forms a harmony. And so Chen Guoying's reading is based on Sima Guang's interpretation of this particular chapter. And for Chen Guoying, non-supreme and the supreme, non-supreme is non-presence, and the supreme are conceptually different, though ontologically interrelated. They are best understood as two dialectically juxtaposed aspects of a singular ontological ground from which the differentiation between finite and infinite arises. So Zhou Yu's text also corresponds to the 齐物论 chapter of the Zhuangzi, which argues that Qi, or you can say energies, or actually there are many meanings of it, is a manifestation of the dialectical relationship between non-presence and presence, Wu and Yo. In this sense, with the AH version, the AH version, which I'm Yin, really expounds the interrelationship linearly. Meaning the AH version, the one not used by Zhu Xi, actually expounds the idea linearly from Wuji to Taiji, whereas the OF version, the one Zhu Xi uses, really try to put them together and emphasize the fact that they are not two ontologies, two different aspects of the same ontological ground. Now, and so Fu Zhenhong basically argues that the term Wuji, non-supreme, is actually not native to Confucianism. Rather, Confucian scholars actually borrowed this term, and the culprit was actually Dong Zhongshu. And so basically, he borrowed this term from Daoism. And so the idea is that for Confucian scholars, before Dong Zhongshu borrowed that idea, the supreme is singularly as a state or non-state of non-differentiation. So this renders the concept of non-supreme really unnecessary. And for Fu Zhenhong, Dong Zhongshu borrowed it for the purpose of convincing the Taoist scholars within the academy at that time that Confucianism it's legitimately recognized as Taoism, and so the idea is that so the idea is so that he can actually justify his concept as the legitimate Confucian school of thinking. And so Fu Zhenhong therefore argues that Zhou Zhenyu's original phrase 自无极而太极 actually corresponds more to Dong Zhongshu's view. So the idea is that Zhou Dunyi probably would use the more Dong Zhongshu idea, 自无极而太极. And then when Zhu Xi annotates the book, he actually transforms it and basically use the more Taoist notion of it to kind of treat these not as two ontologies, but two aspects of the same ontology. Tom H. Fan Dongmei actually explains further that in the Qimulun, ontology is a subjective investigation limited by human perception. And so the Confucian definition of the supreme only as a state or non-state of non-differentiation implies that the difference between differentiation and non-differentiation is still determining the way we understand it. So non-supreme, meanwhile, according to Daoism, is the way things are that is liberated from human perception, conceptualization, and linguistic articulation. So Fan Dongmei regards non-supreme as a concept that serves as a meta-ontological function. He calls it me-ontology. So this means that Zhu Xi's interpretation or revision conforms more faithfully to the original Taoist schema. Now, Wu Kang also argues that Zhu Xi himself is clear about the interdependency between Wuji and Taiji. And then Zhu Xi actually argues the idea that the infinite supreme is a storehouse of heaven and a non-differentiating point of convergence of all generative and differentiating forces. This concept, so the idea is that when Zhu Xi says the infinite supreme is a storehouse of heaven, the term storehouse would immediately ring the alarm bell for anyone who actually knows about Buddhism, because that idea of storehouse really comes from Mahayana Buddhism and its notion of Tathagata-garbha. So what's Tathagata-garbha? The idea is that in Buddhism generally, the idea is that our consciousness, I shouldn't say our consciousness. Consciousness actually is not a singular and unified entity. It's divided into many different domains, including the domain of the eyes, domain of the ears, domain of the nose, domain of the tongue, domain of the body, and domain of the mental domain. Many of these domains are actually formed. The idea is that when it comes, when people begin to ask, when the Buddhist disciples begin to ask, where comes, like the idea is that if consciousness is in operation, how does it come into being? How does it come into this process of becoming? And so in Buddhism, there's a concept. The idea is that, well, it comes from memories and dispositions, or even some people would say habitual energies. Memories and dispositions that can come from my past, from other people's past, when we interact with other people, from the society at large, from my family, from my ancestors, and from many or even from the cosmos in general, or even you can say from other species as well. So the idea is a lot of these memories and dispositions would be deposited in a deep domain called the Alaya consciousness or storehouse consciousness. And this particular storehouse has all kinds of memories and dispositions, including our desire, anger, frustration, delusions, and whatnot, anxiety and fear. But it also has mindful memories and dispositions. These memories and dispositions that Thich Nhat Hanh would argue that they're like seeds, bijas in Sanskrit. They are being planted in a field. And these seeds, and every day when we interact with other people, when we live in general, a lot of these seeds will be nurtured. Most of the time, we nurture seeds of anxiety, anger, desire, frustration. But at the same time, if we meditate and do things right, it can also be a seed, basically a storehouse from which Buddhahood can be generated. Now, so the idea is that you can say that if you nurture enough mindful, the storehouse consciousness become a totally mindful and absolute mindful insight. So in this particular case, it's called Tathagata Garbha. Now, Tathagata Garbha, if I have like 6 hours to talk about this, of course, we can actually talk about it endlessly, because my definition that I have just told you is not the only definition. But for the time being, we'll stay with that definition because it will be useful for us. Okay, so for Mao Zedong, Zhu Xi's understanding of the non-supreme as supreme comes from the Da Shang Qi Xing Lun, which is a treatise on awakening Mahayana faith. And this particular treatise, or sometimes a lot of people call it simply awakening, subdivides all things into 3 things: Qi, meaning ontological ground; Xiang, form or appearance; and Yong, function. And it also divides the consciousness into 2 domains. One of them is called Xing Sheng Nian, or storehouse consciousness, from which the phenomena of arising and perishing appear, Sheng Mian. And then Xing Zhen Ru Men, which refers to precisely the Tathagata Garbha. Now, the Da Shang Qi Xing Lun is a very controversial text because, but I'm not going into a deep discussion of in what way it's been controversial. But the idea is that some people would say that it inspired Buddhism. Others would say that in the Neo-Confucianist inspired the way it was being translated or even being written in China. But the general idea is that the compares compares the cheetah or the scene, like the heart, as the sea. The sea, on the one hand, is we see a lot of waves, we see a lot of movements, we see time, way, a lot of things, we see them. And the idea is that they seem to be rising and perishing, increasing and decreasing, and also, and so they're constantly in movement. But if we think carefully about it, the sea is also simply a body of water. a body of water that doesn't really increase or decrease. When it evaporates, it goes into the atmosphere and it will come back to the sea. And so the idea is that these two, the appearance of waves would be seen 上面面, and whereas the body of water is actually the 心真如门. Now let's think more carefully about this. The idea is that 心生灭门 and 心真如门. 心真如门 seems to be the ontological ground of 心生灭门. But that actually doesn't make logical sense because the waves and the movements are pretty much the way the body of water appears. And the waves and the movement are ultimately just the body of water. So Ti and Xiang actually are neither different nor non-different, neither not different nor non-different. So the idea is that the two are not transcendentally related. You can say that they're different conceptually, or even they're different experientially, but they are actually the same thing. And so now this actually really inflects a lot of way. Zhu actually thinks a lot about 周敦颐 太极图说. And so in the 图说, very interestingly, 周敦颐 actually argues that governance should be based on 诚, honesty or sincerity, which actually defines as an honest respect for how things arise and perish in the way they are. So for him, a sage or wise ruler should be in stasis, which doesn't mean that they shouldn't be moving. It means that they should just let things be as the way they are, 自然. And this has a lot to do, this has been mentioned, of course, in Lao Tzu and also in Zhuangzi as well. And so, but he also curiously thinks that is a sage discipline all the subjects in order for them to fall in line with this particular 自然 government. So basically, Zhou Tuanyi really believes in the use of music, rituals, education, or even disciplinary measures to actually convince other people to fall in line with the sagely rulership. So Zhu Si complicates Zhou Tuanyi's own idea even further. He calls the supreme actually Xin. Or Tathagata. So supreme for him is the Tathagata. For Zhu, the self is subdivided into two things: Yi, which means intentionality driven by desire, and Zhi, which is intentionality driven by Li, or ethics. So we are beginning to see ethics is actually starting to creep in to become the ontological ground itself. An ethical action for him, for Zhu Si, is made when one achieves a unity between these two intentionalities, which are both embedded in the storehouse consciousness. So it makes perfect sense. If we go back to the Da Sheng Qi Xin Wen, memories and dispositions underdetermines our ability to make ethical decisions. So Zhu argues that governing begins with the ruler's decision to establish their intentionality driven by Li and harmonize it with their desire. And such a Li ethics-driven intentionality is then being employed as the ontological ground of knowledge building. So see how that shift is actually starting to happen. Here, ethical governance is called 智信, or enactment of insight. And its goal is for Zhu Si to use discipline and surveillance to limit excessive desires. However, if this is the case, ethics is considered both as the ontological ground and technology of governance. And this continue, and I'm aware of the time, so I'll be quick. This is kind of winding up already. So the double bind of ethics is an ontological ground of politics and technology is further justified by Zhou Dunyi's two students, Chen Hao and Chen Yi. So both call the supreme Li. Basically, supreme for them is ethics. Chen Yi defines Li as Lun, meaning order of things. So Li, ethics, is order of things. Order of things, as we know, is ontology. So for Confucian scholars, the order of things is Chang, permanent. So they therefore regard Li, ethics, as the permanent self-nature or ontological ground of existence. Chen Yi actually defines Li as, so basically Chen Yi argues the highest form of Ren, or human nature of benevolence, is 恻隐之心, sympathy, empathy, compassion, or even just identification. The highest form of Yi is shame and self-contempt. The highest form of Li is withdrawn and yielding, and the highest form of Zhi is heart that can differentiate right from wrong. And Chen Yi starts doing this syllogism, which is really fascinating. The sage which was observe the order of human nature or benevolence. Yet, as suggested by the Zhu Yong, ethical decisions can only be made from subjective position. Therefore, doing the best according to my self-nature is doing the best according to human nature. Doing the best according to human nature is doing the best according to the nature of all things. Doing the best according to the nature of all things is acting in accordance with the way nature nurtures and transforms itself. So once again, ontology is now being translated through this series of syllogisms into technology. So Chen Hao further argues that there is no such thing as a divide between non-supreme and the supreme, and he is actually very open about critiquing Zhou Dunyi himself for employing a thing of double ontology. So rather, as the Zhou Yi argues, that according to Chen Hao, the Tao is a singular ontological ground with metaphysical, meaning infinite, and physical finite aspects. So the idea of Li as the ontological ground of all things for him implies that the power relations in a society follow an ecological order by nature. It does not mean that these social relations always remain unchanged. The ecology is intact and would adjust itself even when different actors in it violate such an order. And so, while this idea sounds very holistic, it has, as we could have seen historically, encouraged political conformism and justified governmental interventions, and in the name of keeping a political ecology intact. Now, because of time, I'm not going to go into Wang Yangming, but I just want to say that in my research, I actually do go into, for example, Wang Yangming, and also, of course, the 1958 Manifesto people, and also like more contemporary Neo-Confucians to kind of like think a little bit about how that ontological and technological double bind works together. Okay, so just as a conclusion, as we have seen, according to the Neo-Confucian debate, ethical governance relies on the ruler's own personal ethical integrity, even though such ethical integrity is supposed to be generated out of their honesty, human nature, or benevolence, or harmony between conflicting intentionalities. So today, as a socialist democracy, managed and regulated by the Communist Party itself, such ethical integrity is supposed to be guided by socialism, which entails precisely as we could see from, as I have pointed out in the very beginning of the talk, a rewriting of Marxism in Neo-Confucian terms and vice versa. In this process of mutual revision, Neo-Confucianism, with its emphasis on self-cultivation and the basis of political ethics, has the effect of redistributing the responsibility of ethical decision-making from the unmarked authority of the party state to the life of everybody. This is different from interpolation, as nobody is turned into a political subject in this process. Rather, the body and the embodied mind bear such ethical responsibility by Wuhua, becoming thing. Becoming things originally is a really holistic idea, but when it is being turned into political technology, it becomes desubjectivization in the kind of negative sense of it. Algorithms in algorithmic governmentality are therefore useful in managing the polity as an assemblage of pure things that is neither subjective nor subjective or objective. It does not mean that on a day-to-day basis, bipolitical lives today have no subjectivity. Of course, everyone has subjectivity. Rather, the process of politicization is entirely indifferent to the diverse processes of subjectivization until, as Zhou Dunyi proposes, discipline and punishment are necessary. If this is the case, technology of control and technology of discipline are also mutually dependent. Perhaps a mutual dependency has always been the underlying force that negotiates the relationship between politics and ethics. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand you the floor to David.